And now, a passage from The Beginnings of American Trade with India, 1784 to 1812, by Holden Furber, from the New England Quarterly, June 1938. On the day after Christmas, 1784, a strange ship appeared off Pondicherry, flying an ensign, never before seen in Indian waters, but one which watchers on shore might easily have mistaken at a distance for the familiar red and white striped flag of the English East India Company. Only when the wind whipped it taut would the circle of 13 white stars in the jack have arrested the eye. She was the United States of Philadelphia. Thomas Bell, master, a stout vessel of 400 tons burden manned by a crew of 40. Loaded with tobacco, Virginia ginseng, naval stores, copper, miscellaneous hardware, and a considerable sum in dollars, she had originally sailed in March for China via Mauritius. But having called at Madeira and taken on 100 pipes of Messrs. Searle and Company's best Madeira wine, she sought the most profitable market for it. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope, she made Acheen Head and then stood over for the Coromandel coast. Fearing at least a cool, if not hostile, reception at a British port, Captain Bell chose to show the Stars and Stripes first at Pondicherry, only to find that the English were still in possession of that settlement which had not yet been restored to the French under the Treaty of 1783. Nevertheless, he received a cordial reception both at Pondicherry and at Madras. Having gone to Madras overland by palanquin, he was given an audience by the Nawab of Arcot, and entertained by some of the leading European merchants. As the first American vessel to arrive on that coast, the United States excited much curiosity and gave rise to many rumors. It was said that her owner, Thomas Willing, one of the wealthiest of Philadelphia merchants, whose son was on board, was contemplating the establishment of an American East India Company with a factory somewhere near Pondicherry, preferably at Porto Novo. It was even asserted that the Nawab, in conversation with Captain Bell, had given him reason to hope for a grant of land for such a settlement, though it was admitted that no letter from the American Congress was presented to the Nawab. Lord Macartney, the governor of Madras, took careful note of all these rumors but discounted most of them. From the reports of the agents whom he employed to elicit information from Captain Bell, he concluded that this voyage, like that of the Empress of China from New York to Canton, the first American venture to China, was an experimental one, speculative in character, and not of great importance. He therefore placed no obstacles in the Americans' way. William Moore, the supercargo on the United States, an Irishman who had sailed in her with the intention of setting himself up in business somewhere in the East, was allowed to stay in India and hire a warehouse in Pondicherry. Nothing was done to indicate that the presence of an American ship in Indian waters so soon after the War of Independence was at all unwelcome. In contrast with this friendly reception at Madras, the first American ship to sail up the Hooghly to Calcutta met with a somewhat less cordial welcome because there was grave ground for suspicion that she was using the American flag to cover a trading venture which was to a considerable extent British. She was the Hydra, formerly a British frigate, commanded by one John Haggie, who had once been first mate of the Royal Henry East Indiaman. His supercargo, William Green, owned her in partnership with the Mr. Champlain of Rhode Island and some merchants in England. She was refitted in the Thames and cleared from Madeira and Rhode Island, but actually went from Madeira to India. After a speedy passage of 4 months, she arrived in the Hooghly in June 1785 under American colors. With no advice from home to guide them, Sir John Macpherson and his council hesitated to allow her to land her cargo. The fact that her supercargo had a French as well as an American commission resolved their doubts. At the request, the Hydra lowered the 13 stripes, hoisted French colors, and landed her cargo under that flag. The Governor General and Council were anxious to find some excuse for allowing her to land her cargo, since they did not wish to furnish the United States with an excuse to prohibit Indian imports. The treatment accorded the first American ships to arrive in India shows rather clearly that the Court of Directors of the East India Company had evolved no specific policy with regard to the American trade. Though aware of some of the dangers to their monopoly inherent in that trade, they apparently did not take seriously the warnings which they received in the 1780s of the dire consequences certain to result from it. One of the most interesting of these came from an anonymous well-wisher of the East India Company who wrote as early as February 1782. The writer of this paper, from whom the East India Company have no claim of service or friendship, owing to the great injustice of a court of directors, who almost ruined him, sacrifices private resentment to give you the following information and proposal. Certain leading members of the American Congress have had in agitation some time a scheme to open a trade from America to the East Indies, of which information has been given to a higher power, both as to the certainty of the intention and the channel it comes through, but which last you cannot possibly be made acquainted with. The unhappy divisions in this country, the ill success of His Majesty's arms, and the confused state of affairs in India makes it more than probable that if ships are not already gone to India from America, they will soon. It is to be hoped His Majesty's ships or your cruisers will fall in with them, but even in that case, the greatest care should be taken where they are carried prisoners, which I would recommend to be Bencoolen, for I am certain, from what I have seen of the Americans, that the suffering them to mix with your own servants will, if possible, contaminate them more to your prejudice. But to send them amongst the quiet Gentoo natives of Indostan, whom I have also seen, I can only compare to the devil sowing the tares amongst the wheat. Another prophet of doom was the indefatigable British consul in Egypt, George Baldwin, whose views about the Americans were first written in 1785 and later printed in his political recollections. When I said that the independency of America, or even an unrestricted trade allowed to them, was pregnant with mischiefs to England, I confess that I suspected from the least of them almost unavoidable perdition to our settlements in the East Indies. Then I say, an unrestricted trade will admit ships of America into all the ports of the East Indies, and this intercourse with our settlements will produce the effect. What is the state of the English settlements in the East Indies? A country almost equal in extent to all Europe and richer in its natural resources, an army of 120,000 men well disciplined, a revenue badly administered capable of defraying such an army, of defraying the civil government, and still of remitting millions sterling annually to England, at a distance mocking all coercion. France and America nearer to them than England, and ever anxious to favor their defection. With such truths to revolve in minds already complaining of the arbitrary exercise of authority, the Americans arrive among them free, exulting, broke loose from all restraints. Need anything be added? In actual fact, the policy pursued by the East India Company toward American ships at their Indian ports in the period before the negotiation of the Jay Treaty was one of friendly toleration. These extravagant warnings of ruin and many less vigorous ones were disregarded, primarily because the trade was so small and because the Pitt cabinet, whose views were expressed through the Board of Control with Henry Dundas at its head, were anxious not to add another irritant to those already complicating Anglo-American relations. As the 1780s wore on, the directors became alarmed at the growth of American trade with China, but they were powerless to prevent its increase, since China was an independent state. The American trade with India prior to the outbreak of war in Europe in 1792 to 1793 was merely ancillary to the China trade. Nothing appreciable was to be gained by putting a stop to it. Though it was presumed to exist on sufferance, no trouble was taken to determine its exact status under the Navigation Acts. No definite code of regulations was sent to governors regarding it, though constantly advised through the reports of the British consuls in New York and Philadelphia of sailings to the East Indies and the beginnings of practices strictly inimical to their monopoly. The directors permitted the American ships which followed the United States and the Hydra into Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay to be received in the same friendly manner. No question was later raised of the right of an American ship to land cargo under the American flag, and no such ship was ever seized or proceeded against except on the ground that the American flag was used to cloak illicit trading by British subjects. The only case of importance involving an American ship before the outbreak of the war in Europe was that of the Chesapeake, which arrived off Calcutta in the autumn of 1787. Her owner was John O'Donnell, formerly a military officer on the Bombay establishment, who had been a merchant in Calcutta. A native of Ireland, he commanded his own vessel and held a commission from the American Congress, a certificate of American naturalization, and a port clearance from Bordeaux to the Cape of Good Hope. The majority of his crew were British subjects, although this would seem to be a clear case of illicit commerce under a foreign flag. The Advocate General of Bengal did not advise her seizure. He held that no action lay unless cargoes were legally the property of British subjects, a point difficult to prove in court, even when the foreign allegiance of owners of vessels could not be established. He added that political considerations dictated forbearance. When the Chesapeake returned to Perth Amboy, New Jersey in 1789 with cargo from Madras, Bengal, and Bombay, the British consular agent in Philadelphia heard that Captain O'Donnell spoke in terms of high respect of the civil treatment he received when he lay in the Ganges. After 1787, references to the use of American ships for remitting the fortunes of British subjects from India to Europe via the United States, and to the illegal introduction of India goods into British territory by the same route begin to appear in the correspondence of the British consuls at Philadelphia and New York, Phineas Bond and John Temple. In July 1787, Bond complained that since 2 or 3 well-freighted ships could supply the purely American demand for India goods, it was obvious that Europeans in India were using American ships for sending remittances home. He gained complete proof of this 10 months later when he succeeded in obtaining an exact account of the cargo of the ship Commerce, which Captain Bell brought in from Madras in May 1788. She carried 50,000 pounds worth of goods, 30,000 worth on the owner's account, and 20,000 worth in consignments from various Europeans in Madras. Shortly before this, Temple, at New York, wrote to the Foreign Secretary, the Marquis of Carmarthen. Observing the number of ships and vessels that have made voyages from these states to India, and the many more that are preparing to import tea and other articles from the East, I lately desired a gentleman in whom I have much confidence to take a suitable moment of asking a principal merchant in this city, who is largely concerned in India voyages, whether he was not apprehensive that the markets of this country would be overdone with tea and other articles from India. The answer was by no means, for whatever we import from India more than is wanted here, we can readily dispose of in England and Ireland. I sent, said this merchant, 250 chests of tea to England last October, and they sold very well. Of this being a fact, I have no doubt, though I was much surprised at hearing of it. If thus the vending of tea and other articles of India brought from thence in American bottoms, as I should think it must be, detrimental to our India Company, to the navigation, and to the general commerce of this nation, it would not, I apprehend, be difficult to prevent such importation from this country. A month later, Temple learned that a ship of 500 tons was building near Boston for the East India trade, owned principally by Lane and Fraser of London, a house well known to have been favored by government during the baneful administration of Lord North. By the time Jay went to England to negotiate his treaty, American ships were engaged to a considerable extent in a circuitous trade between India and Europe. In carrying on this trade, American captains were greatly assisted by the facilities accorded them at the French island of Mauritius. In 1788, Stephen Higginson of Boston even prophesied that with American assistance at Mauritius, the French would gain within a few years the command of the English trade to India. After the beginning of the war in Europe, it was more than ever essential from a British standpoint that American trade with British Indian ports should be a direct trade, confined solely to supplying a strictly American demand for India goods. This was the result aimed at by Article 13 of Jay's treaty, and it is most extraordinary that more care was not used in drafting this article regulating American participation in the East India trade. In the draft which Jay submitted to Lord Grenville, dated September 30th, 1794, and never seen in Philadelphia because it was so damaging to American interests, this article appeared as a simple statement permitting American ships to import freely into His Majesty's possessions in Asia any of the productions and manufactures of the United States, and to carry thence any of the productions or manufactures of those countries directly to the United States, but not directly to any part of Europe. This language would probably have met with the approval of the East India Company's directors, and it is astonishing that Lord Grenville approved of a final draft in which this article was much more loosely drawn. When one reads Article 13 of Jay's treaty, it is impossible to tell whether it was originally meant to be the equivalent of the statement above mentioned. At first sight, the intent seems to be the same, but the actual wording certainly did not insist upon direct voyages to India, or confine American cargoes which might be landed at British ports to the productions and manufactures of the United States. The India goods were obviously to be carried only to American ports on a direct voyage, but an express prohibition of export to any part of Europe was not included. Had the Pitt ministry foreseen the consequences of the long European war, it is inconceivable that Article 13 would have been allowed to remain in this form. As it stands, it reflects the willingness of the British government to be accommodating about what they considered a minor point in the negotiations. The placing of American ships on a par with those belonging to British subjects as to duties levied at British Indian ports, and the granting of refreshment at St. Helena are indications of this. No one seems to have noticed the lamentable lacunae in this article which helped to make it possible for American ships to infest the eastern seas after Napoleon's rise to power.